We're live.
Hello, everybody. My name is Alnoor Bhimani. I'm the director of the South Asia Centre at the London School of Economics for another webinar. Today's webinar is religion activism, and we have a pretty outstanding set of speakers whom I'll shortly, but thank you first of all to the speakers for coming. Also, thank you very much for all of you who are attending. I know many of you have signed up to this event from far and wide, and I know you're in different time zones, so thank you for that. You will know, of course, that we are on Zoom. We used to hold these sessions live until about 2 years ago, but being on Zoom means that we pretty much operate in the same way that we did before. You're welcome after the introductions and after the interventions by the speakers to ask questions. You can ask questions to specific speakers or to all the speakers. I'll see your questions on the chat, so I'll be able to basically outline what these were. If you'd like to tag us, then we are at SIALSC, so the South Asia LSE. Ask questions and you remain anonymous. This webinar that I think speaks of issues that are today across the world. Art is transforming societies. It probably always has done that. The interesting thing is that we ask questions about whether we can dissociate art from the artist. Of course, there are bad people who do good art, and there are very good people who do good art. The interesting thing might be to ask questions around the notion of religiosity. Is art based on religious symbols, religious figures? Does that enhance one's belief in religion? Does it alter it? Should there be a connection between the two? Likewise, we have a new notion of art activism. Absolutely fascinating. Art has perhaps always been about moving social structures, about the politics of the situation that people face. Some people see art as being the ultimate site of resistance. It is about social change. It is about political change. Some individuals will say that art has become too commercialized. Perhaps it is too much of a financial instrument for investment. Does that take away from art's ability to move people? That's an interesting question. So these are all issues that we'll be exploring in this webinar today. Let me then introduce the speakers who are truly outstanding. And thank you again to you for coming. I'll introduce Salima Hashmi first, who she may not recall, but I have met her several times at in Lahore at Bitfest and at the and I hope to meet you again sometime. But Salima is basically a Pakistani artist. She's a retired professor. She was a dean at the National College of Arts in Lahore. She's also an anti-nuclear weapons activist. She comes from a renowned literary family, so she's the great poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Perhaps she'll speak to a wide variety of exposures that she's had art scene in Pakistan, not just sort of artistic outcomes, but what is at the verge. And hopefully we'll also have time to look at this notion of digital art. So I hope to explore that as well. And perhaps I'll put a few questions in relation to that to Salima. We also have Dr. Santhosh Sadanadan. Very happy to have you here. He is an art historian. He is a cultural theorist. He teaches at the School of Creative Expressions, a lovely title, department at the Ambedkar University in Delhi. And I've read some of his, and I have to say he writes beautifully. I'd also like to introduce davinder.s.toor. He's a UK-based Indian and Islamic arts collector and dealer, and he has many other interests. I met him shortly before the pandemic began. That was a lovely meeting, and he said a few things about Sikh art, which I thought was very fascinating. So, well, Davinder, great to have you. The way that we structure is that each of the speakers will spend between 6 to 8 minutes talking about the issues that interest them and about their expertise, and ask them a few questions, and then we'll open up to general questions and answer. So the order that we're going to do this is that Salima will speak first, followed by Santhosh, and then we'll have Davinder speaking. So over to you, Salima. Thank you.
Thank you. They say you shouldn't start a talk with a disclaimer, but I have to because, I'm no scholar. And my life's work has really been in the teaching studio, working with young people and occasionally with children who are learning to think visually and to observe, and they're learning to analyze the world, both the inner and the outer, and to try and understand the dialectics between reality and the dream and the passion which human beings carry in our hearts' imagination. So living as we do in an unfree world, it impairs our ways of seeing and understanding. And clarity comes, but it comes at a cost. And the teaching studio thus becomes a kind of a lab where students are companions of the people who teach, like myself, in the task of really unraveling the complexities of our living. It's therefore pertinent that I share images with you of artists who've either been in my lab or other labs, and but all have somehow shared the profoundly satisfying happiness of discovery at the moment of creation. That path of discovery, which can be the path of liberation, which is a risky proposition. And so I'm not going to apologize really for speaking to you through images, because that's how we think, and through images. And that is where we take our positions. That is where we respond to oppression and suffering or whatever. And the works come out of the everydays of our turbulent history, political, social. You've spoken of religiosity. I think that sort of runs like a thread through it, but there also are artistic histories. And one cannot really, I can't really can't list you the many artists who struggled against ideological control through their work. These are just a very few that I'm going to show you. And but through these sharings, we move through different decades, and we touch upon events and tyrannies, big and small. There is self-reflection, of course, the investigation into ideas, but it's not disconnected from social realities, nor is it kind of self-conscious about the deeper quests that drive artists and their oeuvres. So critical theory is one thing, but the desperation felt by a creative individual or a group or a community is quite another. When they are unable to manifest what they're compelled to communicate in tangible form. I have in mind, for example, the blasphemy law in Pakistan, which presents a kind of a no-go situation, because it makes a difference between life and death if you choose to probe it. Anyway, so forgive me for dispensing with theory, and let me show you some images of civic courage. So very quickly, I'm going to look at certain images. We can go to the first one, which is work done during the Zia era. It is the work of an artist who at that time was very young. His name is Afshar Malik, and we talked earlier about the possible connection between literature and art. Yes, and here it is. So he's quoting directly from Faiz, two works here. One, Mere Hamdam Mere Dost, my friend, my companion, and the other, self-explanatory, is Bol, speak. And thus, we go on to this era, which was the era of Ziaul Haq, And I'm just showing you the last page of the Women's Manifesto, which was Women Artists Manifesto, which was signed in 1983, which at the time was a secret document. I received today this book, which is actually carries this manifesto. It's the second international publication which carries this manifesto, which is called the Manifesto of the Women Artists of Pakistan. And these are the signatures that you're seeing of 15 artists who signed it in 1983. I'm not going to read you the manifesto, but I'll just very quickly go over the beginning of it, which says, "We, the women artists of Pakistan, having noted with concern the decline in the status and conditions of life of Pakistani women, and having noted the adverse effects of the anti-reason, anti-arts environment on the quality of life in our homeland, and having noted the significant contribution the pioneering women artists have made to the cause of arts and art education in Pakistan, and believing as we do in the basic rights of all men, women, and children to a life free from want and enriched by the joys of fruitful labor and cultural self-realization, and our commitment as practitioners and teachers of the arts to the noblest ideals of a free, rational, and civilized existence." And they say, and we affirm the following principle to guide us in our struggle for the cultural development of our people, to serve as the manifesto of the women artists of Pakistan. And there are 7 principles that follow. And we had to keep this document secret, because at the time, in Zia's time, this could be considered a document which promoted sedition. Now it's published in 2 international publications and 1 local publication, my own book on women artists of Pakistan. Treading that fine line between what one was practicing and what one felt was the mood of the moment, our reality is something that we live with. Duria Kazi, this is a work from 1981. She's primarily known as a sculptor, but this is a work that she did at that time. And it was when the edict started coming out about how the women should be covered, what was correct in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And as she described the time, she said the sound of silence was deafening. Therefore, when we look at the many issues, this is one of my own works, which is much later. It's called Poem for Zainab, and it is about what women suffer during, the cases that we hear of domestic violence. Recently, as we know, during the pandemic, there has been almost a worldwide epidemic of violence against women. This was a particular case in which this woman called Zainab was attacked by her husband, who was a Maulana, a clergyman, and I can't even describe to you what was done to her. And in this, I use my own face. And there is the silencing that occurs, which is something that women are familiar with, but this week in particular, I think we are taking note of it for a number of reasons. Naisa Khan's work, which was Henna Hands, which was a woman's body, this was in the studio, made with templates using henna and describing the woman through it. Henna templates for decoration of the body, or hands and feet are well known, but not for the body. And then she takes it out of the studio and takes it into the streets of Karachi. And there, 5 o'clock in the morning, she goes with her student and they make these.
Salima ji, I'm going to interrupt you. Sorry, yeah. I'm going to interrupt you. Could you please ask your colleague to move the slides? We can't see the images.
Oh, that's so strange.
So if you could please go back and start speaking again very briefly.
Okay, it says your screen sharing is poised. Okay. Should we, why is that here? Can you, okay. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So the first one was to do with Bowl, which was based on Fez's poetry, 2 poems. I think the one on the right, which is Bowl, which is Speak, is self-explanatory, done during Zia's time. And I think that, the fact that a very, very young artist did this work, which at that time could have landed him up behind bars, is something significant. We talked about, okay. Duria Kazi and the Silence. Women, the sculptor who goes over to photography because it's more pertinent to what is happening to women's bodies at the time. My own work, which had to do with domestic violence of the most incredible kind. And Naiza Khan. Why is this jumping around?
I don't know why it's jumping.
It's, I have no idea why this is happening.
Ask them if they can still see.
Would you like to take over from there, or should I continue with this? Because there seems to be some glitch, which is a technical glitch. Never happened before our end. Can you see it? Can you see the image?
This seems fine.
Okay. They said that the screen sharing has stopped because the shared window is closed.
Hang on.
Are we there?
Yes.
Sharing, it says. Okay. So these are the signatures of the women who signed that document. As I said, it was secret. We didn't want it to be known, but it certainly altered the way that we looked at our own practice. Many of these women were very apolitical in the way that they considered themselves artists. And yet, it says your screen sharing is something that's happening your end, I think.
I don't know. I think it's an internet router.
Maybe it's an
So
internet.
let's have it like this.
Okay. But these are the women. 5 of them have now passed on, but this was a daring thing to do at that time. My own work. Now, this is Naiza's work, who is now a very well-known artist. This is when she was much younger. She takes the work out of the viewing studio, out of the gallery, and onto the streets of Karachi. And she's with us, goes up 5 o'clock in the morning to work with her student, puts them on the walls, and there they are. And of course, after a while, they disappear, they deface. There was one just the opposite side of the street here, which was a barber shop, and she had another image there. And I visited it, and that image was perfectly okay. Nobody had touched it. So I asked the barber that, didn't you have any objection to this, image? And he said, no, actually, my practice has really flourished since I got this image put on the wall by some kind artist. We're looking now on Imran Qureshi's work, which I hope you can see. It's called The Blessings Upon the Land of My Love, which also referred to a title of one of Fez's poems. And I hope you can see it. It was in the Sharjah Biennale, in this heritage building. When you walked into this space, for a second, you were totally horrified because you felt you were at the site of a massacre. And we who lived through terrorist attacks, especially in our mosques, we know what it looks like. I have visited a mosque in my neighborhood, Ahmadiyya Mosque, which suffered such an attack in which a friend of mine, an artist, lost her father. But when you walk in, when you get closer, suddenly the image changes, and you start looking at what the artist means. And this is what you find. Out of these flourishes of red come these blossoms, an absolute testament to the persistence of life, to the taking over of the carnage and making something beautiful out of it, refusing to believe in the carnage. Adila Suleiman, who lives in Karachi, also has witnessed ethnic strife in Karachi. She's a sculptor, and she takes a reference from stories of great legends of warriors that kept on warring and fighting even when their heads had been severed from their bodies. And then also talking about what comes from under their feet. So there is that persistence of beauty which refuses to be overtaken, which refuses to be suppressed, which wants to be part of the story. If you look at it, she employs traditional ways of making these. She brings in artisans in an equal partnership, because if you go to her studio, you will have the urban artisans working with her, giving their opinion about what should be done next. Farida Batul, who lives in Lahore, this is an image, it's actually a lenticular print. So when you move in front of it, this little girl skipping rope starts moving. Behind it is a scene of devastation, that is Lahore, burnt by mobs in response to the cartoons that were published, you know, the other side of the world in Denmark, which were, in sort of against Islamic idealism with reference to the Holy Prophet. But while people are destroying where they live, this little girl is dancing. The title of the work is Nahi Reesan Sheher Lahore. Yeah, there's no place like Lahore. So it's kind of playing on this idea of the future, which she embodies, our present, which is behind her, and hopefully much behind us. Ruby Chishti, who currently lives in New York, is a sculptor. This is a work which is done. In fact, I showed it in my gallery many, many years ago. It says, my birth will take place 1,000 times, no matter how you celebrate it. It is about the birth of a girl child. In her case, the fourth birth child, a girl child in her family, sorry. And there was, of course, much weeping and wailing, another female. I think that we often think of resistance and activism only in reference to the state and the oppression of the state. What about the societies we live in and the oppressiveness of many other forms of living, of the way that we conduct our lives, of the way that society is structured? And she uses, these figures which are not quite doll-like and not quite human-like. They rest somewhere in between. And I think that I had never had so many people come off the street to see work in my gallery as, her work. Aisha Jatoi's Clothesline, which she chooses a public square in Lahore. Our squares have a lot of submarines and fighter planes and such like objects masquerading as artworks in city squares. So she decided, as an intervention, to bring her washing, all red clothes, which she dried on this fighter plane. She was intercepted by a policeman who asked her, what did she think she was doing? And she just said very innocently, I'm just drying my laundry. And all of this was videotaped. And to me, it's a really wonderful comment on the vulnerability of these toys that boys have and how women can intervene and bring them down to the level of our own lives. And these are just a few images of students intervening in public spaces, of protesting against the Taliban, of using slogans, of working on the tarmac, wanting to be heard. It says Aman aur Rawadari Hamara Pakistan, which is, peace, and Rawadari is politeness, it's tradition. That is our Pakistan. And just some young people on the streets. I'm just ending with these few images of an installation by a group which is called Awami Art Collective, which is, the art collective of ordinary people. It refers again to a line from Fairs, Hum ke tarik rahon mein mare gaye, we who were killed in the dark alleys. Each of these flags has a text which refers to a sectarian or other killing during the last 10 years. And each of them was a cutting from a newspaper. So while the flags have this festive air, when people are actually reading the text as they go through, there is this chilling realization of what has happened to our civic living in our times. And it was a huge installation in a public garden, public park of Lahore, and we have thousands of people visiting it. and reading each one of those texts, which is a reminder of the people killed by terrorism, by ethnic conflict, by sectarian conflict, by communalism in where we are. So very quickly, this was just a rush through these works that have become transnational in the way they talk about what artists go through, and also trans-historical, because the contestation of given ideologies through artistic agencies, it continues today with energy, and it's well camouflaged as the pursuit of beauty.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Salima. I think that short presentation raises a lot of issues, and I hope to explore some of that with the audience and others. So we'll move on now to Santhosh, and if you'd like to give your short presentation, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Alnoor. Am I audible? Thank you. To begin with, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this as a speaker for this event. I think it is a very timely event, and I am more or less going to kind of read out some of the points that I have thought may be pertinent to this, or to the larger issue that this panel discussion is trying to kind of address or evoke or interrogate. So I thought, to keep the time, I thought I will write it down, some of the points, so that we won't cross so much of time. So I really meant, it's timely, keeping in mind the kind of political situation, especially the kind of place that I am located in, of India, which is witnessing a surge in various kinds of majoritarianism, like many other parts of the world. Some of you might be aware of the ugly events that are still unfolding as I'm speaking, of the systematic attack by the Hindu right on, for instance, Muslim girls wearing hijab in educational institutions. In the southern state of Karnataka, most of the institutions are shut down due to widespread attack on the girls wearing hijab. We need to locate this attack in the context of the right to not only practice one's own religious faith, but also the right to representation, the visible representation in particular. In the context of the present attack on the girl students on the basis of sartorial representation, I would like to bring our attention to an event that took place in 2007 at the prestigious Faculty of Fine Arts, MS University of Baroda, a town located in Western India. I will speak about this incident through somewhat a first-hand knowledge, because I was very much part of that event, as well as using this moment as an opportunity to critically reflect upon certain pitfalls of art historical discourses. So this is what the premise of my presentation. Let me briefly narrate the incident for the unfamiliar audience, the incident that unfolded in the Faculty of Fine Arts. In May 2007, members of a group of an ultra-Hindu nationalist organization forced their entry into a graduation display of fine arts students and vandalized and eventually confiscated the work of one final year MFA student, Chandramohan, alleging that he has portrayed Hindu gods and goddesses in an offensive or vulgar manner. Chandramohan was not only physically assaulted, but was jailed for a period of time, and the then Dean of the Art School was suspended for allegedly failing to support the ruling regime of the university, which openly sided with the intruders, ironically. Eventually, this incident led to a protest that carried on for many months by students, teachers, and artists against the attack on the art student or artistic freedom of expression, and the suspension of the then Dean, Professor Shivaji Kapanikar. As usual, the justification given by the Hindu right to defend this attack was the most commonly used rhetoric of hurting religious sentiments. The defense of the academic and artist community against such rhetoric stemmed from two premises. The one, the constitutional guarantee of freedom of expression. Second, the autonomy of university as an institution. The autonomy argument is the one major argument, in fact, put forward against the such kind of rhetoric, right-wing put forth. Interestingly, one artist's name that was dragged into this controversy time and again by the right-wing camp in order to partly villainize the student Chandra was M.F. Hussain. The right wing tried to equate both these artists and projected them as anti-Hindu. So there was the kind of strategy they have deployed the public sphere through news channels, especially local news channels and local Gujarati newspapers and so on. Let me briefly describe the major work of Chandra Mohan that was the center of the controversy. I'm not going to show the image. You can actually kind of see it because of time. I'm not able to show the The work was a large-scale woodcut print of a female form, arguably the deity of Durga. Deity Durga is portrayed as giving birth. If you look at the work carefully, the life-giving female figurine is depicted at the same time trying to kill the half-born baby with a trident. So there is an act of giving birth and an act of destruction as well. So this is a kind of simultaneous occurrence that we can witness in this image. So as a way of defending Chandra Mohan's work, the students put up an exhibition of images of nude representation of Hindu deities from the historical past, thereby claiming that nudity has been an integral part of Indian religious art. Let us take a look at this point in time. What was the story that Chandra Mohan actually in that sense told about this image? He argued that, or he kind of told the media as well as everybody around that he developed this image through some kind of an experience that he had. Especially he repeatedly dreamed of his village deity. That is, that deity is both benevolent and malevolent. That's the kind of a deity that he is talking about. And this artwork, he argued that it's a figuration of or a direct reference to those dreams. So what we need to keep in mind here is that Chandra Mohan is a first-generation student from a caste subaltern background, hailing from a carpenter family. Another aspect to be kept in mind is that Chandra Mohan is a worshipper of this deity. In that sense, it is both a spiritual and an aesthetical image. So it was a kind of a very interstitial kind of an existence. It is both, for him, it is both a spiritual and an aesthetical image. My first proposition is that one needs to take into account this aspect of caste location, with conventional or secular art discourses have failed to develop as a strategy in order to resist the rightist onslaught. My argument is that the right-wing attack on M.F. Hussain is premised upon equating his act of making an image not as producing a new iconography, but in fact as destructive, as an iconoclastic activity. They connect this to their claim of how Hindu icons were destroyed by quote-unquote Muslim invaders. In that sense, Hussain and his images are projected as a modern representation of Islamic iconoclasm. Even though the right-wing equated Hussain and Chandra Mohan, if we look closely at two instances, we will see that there are differences. In the case of Chandramohan's work, the right-wing attacks stemmed from a phobia of heterogeneous icon worship or iconographic practices. In other words, this instance can be read as the right-wing iconophiles' phobia of icons themselves. However, in the defense of Chandramohan, not much else was argued by the artistic and academic community other than to claim that there is a presence of nudity in Indian art, which ironically is Brahminical in character. It was a lost opportunity that could have opened up debates around the history of the appropriation or destruction of the worshipping practices and image cultures of the caste subalterns. My argument is that a nationalist and Brahminical history of iconophilia, in fact, developed through the active destruction of subaltern religions and their heterogeneous iconographies. And we need to interrogate this sanitized history of icons in the Indian context, produced by both colonial and nationalist historiography. Let me end with citing two major historical moments from India's anti-colonial history to illustrate this point. The first one, what I call the accumulative process of modern iconophile or iconophile, inaugurated by Balagangadhara Tilak in the form of Ganpati festivals as a response to Islamic public religious festivals like Muharram. A liminal figure like Ganpati, which is evocative of animistic or totemic religions, is in this process elevated into the majoritarian Hindu pantheon. Phenomenologically, this act created a new iconophilia. It led to the construction of a new spectacular iconography through the deployment of a unified experience of religion in public sphere. And it played a crucial role in producing modern Hindu mass culture. The second moment is what I call the distributive process inaugurated by M.K. Gandhi and his distribution of the mythical figure of Rama as Maryada Purush, man of principle, among the masses. At the same time, Gandhi ascribed the worshipping practice to individual units of the self and family, not to the mass worship. Hindu men have to cultivate themselves the singular image of Rama. We know that, even though it is not Gandhi's Rama, that singular image of Rama, how it has developed and become part of the armory of the right wing, especially in the 90s. What this distributive process produced is a proximal distance to the Hindu god among the subaltern caste group. That is, it has a doubleness to it, a feeling of being close to the Brahminical icons, but it's also always remain as distant to the subaltern. This process was crucial in forging a nationwide Hindu religious identity as a source of national identity. In both these instances, we witness the homogenization of image culture, and critical interrogation of this process of homogenization is a necessary condition for any artistic resistance against the majoritarian ethos that dominate our present. Thank you.
Thank you, Santhosh, for these observations. Hopefully we'll get to further. I'll move on to Davinder. If you'd like to, and I know you're constrained, but if you'd like to give you a short break, and you'll probably be the first one to get a question from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Alnoor, for the introduction and also for the invitation. Okay, so I'm going to present a few slides to you, given this very interesting topic, and I'm going to come at this from the perspective of a second generation here in the UK, a voice of the diaspora, and also as an art collector. Much of my motivation to collect art, I've realized only very recently, has been subconscious, and only recently have I been kind of seeking things out with a conscious mind. And I'm going to present probably more questions than I am answers here, but I'm going to share with you a part of my journey and how I've viewed art from the Sikh perspective. So identity and religious iconography. So the Sikhs are not iconoclast, and many Sikhs, will grow up in their homes with an image of Guru Nanak, the founder of the faith, like this. And many of you would have seen an image such as this, either in somebody's home or in a temple. And, I began to question, we had a picture like this up in our house that shapes the mind of any young person very early on. And, you begin to kind of, this becomes synonymous with Sikh identity, the posture, the features of a guru, the complexion, the dress. And over time, as many kind of adolescents or those in their early 20s, when you start asking your kind of identity-based and existential questions, you want to try and piece together your identity and who you are and where you've come from, you start to question images like this. And this was the same sort of time that I began collecting art. Now, this image only dates to 1969. So when looking at authentic representations of any guru, you must ask the question, well, how did this image from 1969 become the image of the Sikh gurus? Now, the earliest images of the gurus from earliest forms of art, actually, in the Sikh artistic tradition, actually come from the manuscript tradition. And these are images that are from the Janam Sakhis, the life stories of the gurus. And these are, events and stories that are told. And the earliest known images of the Sikh gurus date from the middle of the 17th century. The Sikhs in that time were providing patronage to various artists and telling those stories of the gurus. Over time, you can see various illustrations of Baba Nanak, Guru Nanak, his life through those Janam Sakhis in the 17th century and the early 18th century. This is an early depiction, the earliest depiction of Guru Nanak that the Europeans would have seen. This is something that was actually commissioned by a Frenchman, Antoine Polier, who had this manuscript commissioned, and it says there at the bottom, you can read there, it describes Guru Nanak and also his constant companion by Mridana. So this is the earliest times this is 150 years or so before the Punjab is in conflict, comes into conflict with the British. From that period, so we see these early images of the gurus, and then what we find is that there's royal patronage, and then we see, we ask the question here about the religious tradition and the art, and how religion is shaped by art and vice versa, and I think for many people, I speak for myself only at this stage, but is how do I reconcile? There's two main problems I have, and one is how do I reconcile the position between religious identity and cultural identity? How do they mix and flow into one another? What is Sikh? What is not Sikh? What is Punjabi and not Punjabi? How do I define myself? The other challenge I think that I've had initially it began as a challenge, but as I've become to kind of accept the situation, it's been very liberating, is understanding the fluidity of the artistic traditions, but also philosophically how things are evolving and constantly changing shape. There isn't any. Initially, there was a notion of I'm looking for truth. How do I find the truth that existed at the times of the gurus, for example, in the 16th century? And then you realize over time, well, the philosophical traditions were changing shape very soon, and during the lives of the gurus themselves, through the 18th century, through the 19th century. So I am also in that flow. I have to be, there's no absolutes. The moment I start thinking absolutes, then I begin to have a problem. The moment I realize that actually my identity is changing shape and form every time, then suddenly there's liberation with that. So what we see here is a painting from the 17th century where this central figure here in grey is actually a patron who has inserted himself into the picture of Guru Nanak seated on this rug beneath the banyan tree reciting these hymns. Now you suddenly see this mix of the royal patrons becoming a part of that very religious art that we were looking at being so iconic earlier. Under the young Ranjit Singh, we find one of the greatest gifts that he gave us was the fact that he gave further patronage to those very kingdoms and artistic courts where these artists were flourishing, particularly up in the Punjab hills in Kangra and Guler. And then what we begin to see is art transcending works on paper, but also we see images of him on sword hilts. We'll find once the patrons of our European patrons, we have local Punjabi artists documenting what's happening in Lahore. These are the grounds of Lahore Fort and the kingdom and the very cosmopolitan and colourful darbar of Ranjit Singh. And we start to see here, this is now taking a bit more of a kind of cultural shape. There's nothing of religious significance here. This is a religious tradition that has then evolved and shaped over time where, people like Ranjit Singh or kings like Ranjit Singh were very much emulating the great Mughal rulers before them. They were inhabiting the forts that those Mughal rulers inhabited. And they were, doing everything that those rulers did before them. They were filling their boots in many ways. We have this wonderful change that happens. The Sikh artistry. The Sikhs are only in power for really about 50 years or so. So early forms of Sikh art from the 16th and 17th century are very, very scarce. Most of what we have left behind is what's been left behind from Ranjit Singh's Lahore. And during that very short period of time, what we find is that we have local artists depicting local people. That then moves on to local artists depicting local people, but for a foreign audience, so for a foreign patron. And here, what we have is an example of a foreign artist, and in this case, August Sherft, who is painting and documenting Maharaja Sher Singh here, who sits on the golden throne, which we know from the V&A after Ranjit Singh's death. The final section here of this short presentation is another aspect of art which I consider particularly valuable, and that is when we look at piecing together this narrative. So let's say my motivation is to understand who I am and to understand how I got here. Then what I need to do is to piece together this story, this narrative. And art, in many ways, it provides that documentary evidence, which tells us what was shaping the traditions of the Punjab in this case. And we'll have images here of Rani Jind Kaur, who was Maharaja Ranjit Singh's last wife. Some of these images that I'm sharing with you are both from public collections and private collections, and some items that I've found over the years. And this is a painting of her painted by George Richmond, who she sits for in London just a few months before her death, after many years of exile, and shortly after she's reunited with her son Maharaja Dalip Singh. We then have proof of what was happening because we can find objects that are depicted in those very works of art that help narrate to us what that Sikh and Punjabi story was. We know that Rani Jind Kaur had 600 items of her jewelry confiscated, for example. So now we have these very physical works of art, which were, a sign of wealth and royalty and sovereignty. The young Dalip Singh, a painting painted by George Beechey, and this was commissioned for Lord Dalhousie, who became the Governor General of Punjab. And up until 1990, this hung up at the estate in Scotland of Colston, and now is in private hands. And you can look closer at this, and you'll see that this young boy who's been separated from his mother is now wearing an ivory miniature portrait of Queen Victoria around his neck. These are, once again, understanding these works of art and how they relate to our story helps us to better understand who we might be as, how do I describe myself? Am I a British, Sikh, an Indian? What am I? How do I put that together? One of the earliest portraits, if not probably the last portrait of the young Dalip Singh, painted by a lady called Helen Mackenzie in Punjab before he leaves. It's probably one of the last portraits of him there. And once again, up until about 6 or 7 years ago, was still hanging on the walls in Lord Dalhousie's estate. So in many ways, this was a trophy that the Lord was happy to keep. Lastly, I think, and I'll finish on this one, is that we have images such as this, which is dates from around about the time of the annexation of the Punjab to the British East India Company. And at that time, what happens is that we don't just lose the artistic traditions. If those very artistic traditions of those works of art are our windows to being able to have a conversation with somebody from the past, somebody who's left us evidence of who they are, and said, look, here I am, this is who I am. This piece of evidence here shows us that when the Punjab was annexed, many traditions die. And this captures those warriors who look very feeble here. We have this warrior here on this emaciated horse. They've got repairs to their swords. And what happens is that the Sikh warriors who were once the guardians of the faith in the north now start to flee down south and go to Hyderabad. They are fleeing the north, and they take with them all the traditions that they have. And from that point on, in the middle of the 19th century, those traditions drastically change shape in the north. Most of us Punjabi immigrants here in the UK, for example, we come from those Punjabis in the north. Now, when I want to trace back my philosophical traditions, where do I trace them to? Because I myself am a product of that colonization, and here I am now. Very much the language that I think in is English. I don't think in the Punjabi language even, and yet I'm trying to understand those traditions. And art for me is the vehicle which helps to unpack that. And most importantly, I've found is to, as I unpack that, I begin to realize that rather than think about it from a Western mindset, I begin to see more and more each day this pluralistic approach that once existed that makes far more sense to me. And the farther I get away from that pluralistic approach, the more issues and problems I have as I start to find these absolutes and start to think in black and whites. And I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Davinder. Absolutely fascinating thoughts there. I'll start with putting a question to you. I have a copy of your book, In Search of Empire, which I have to say is a work of art in itself. It's a beautiful book. Very happy. I wish I could show it to the audience, really nicely, kind of hardback cover with the golden rooms and really fantastic collection of photos there. But some of the comments that you make are equally interesting. And I'm looking at an artistic painting of Guru Nanak. And below that, you say, you ask the question, did Nanak really look like this? Or is the painter trying to remind us of his inclusivity and universal appeal? You ask a question, but you don't answer it. And I wonder, looking at a pattern of Sikhism art, whether you've come to an answer in relation to that.
Yeah, well, I kind of always had an answer in my mind, but wasn't necessarily sharing it. But I think, I think many will probably think this, but I often think about Indian miniature paintings as almost like being, they're very allegorical in nature, and they're like pieces of music. There's a mood that's being set there. There's lots of information to be unpacked. It's not necessarily always about having a true identification of a character. It's not about giving you a true image of somebody. It is in many cases, in certain fine Mughal miniatures, for example, but you look at that image and you think to yourself, what's the story here? And that particular image that you're referring to, what we have is, if I think it's the same image, is that you have Guru Nanak meeting the Siddhs, meeting the yogis in the early part of his life when he's young, his beard is black. You immediately actually can't identify him easily in that picture, because firstly he's young, but also because he's wearing a silly topi associated with Sufis, and he has a tilak on his forehead associated with the Hindu faith. He also has a thread around his body associated with the Brahmins. And and he's flanked on either side, on one side by a Hindu, on another side by a Muslim, his constant companions. And he's having this debate, this conversation with the Siddhs, the yogis who are highly revered, these Ganapati yogis, and they meet him by this lake, and they're asking him questions. And the image that's being depicted there, there's a conversation attached to that, which is in the Guru Granth Sahib, and they ask him questions about his identity. They ask him questions: who are you? What do you believe in? Who's your God? And he comes back with questions of his own, and everything that he points to actually saying that there is no, forget the religious labels. We're all the same. I'm everything and nothing all at once. And actually all you have before you is my character. And I think that's what the artist is pointing towards. I think to search for a true image of Guru Nanak, or to even want to know what he looked like, is in itself a distraction. And that's what's hard. And I think particularly hard, it certainly wasn't a problem for those who existed at the time that the painting was painted, but it's a very particular problem for people of my generation, let's say, or from those who were born here, who say, well, actually, I need to know what he looked like. Unless you can tell me what he looked like, then I'm not interested. And you kind of think, well, we're kind of missing the point a little bit. So that was what I was kind of bringing up there in that description.
Okay, that's very interesting. You're also a great collector of Islamic art, and in a sense, the question around, you're going to find actually representations of the Prophet in it, but you will find representations according to the art, flowers and gardens and birds and so on. And I wonder, whether that contrast, you think, has a different impact on individuals. You talked about, the search, especially within the diaspora, of individuals wanting to subscribe to the notion of religious values, if only they could see, for instance, so what is the contrast in your mind between the two?
Sorry, so the connection was very bad then. I didn't quite fully. It was breaking up for me a little bit. The question.
Sorry.
But can you repeat the last?
No, absolutely. If you can comment, you're a great collector of Islamic art. Can you comment on the same sort of question in relation to Islamic art, where you will not find? I don't think you'll find sort of depictions of the Prophet, but you'll find depictions of God's beauty in the Muslim artist.
Sorry, Alnoor, that's in the connection. I don't know if anybody else is having issues with the connection, but I couldn't hear clearly.
Yes, we cannot hear properly.
Okay, all right. You can't hear me now at all?
I can hear you intermittently. I'm sorry. I think what you said was how does the parallel with Islamic art, and whether Islamic art is also having, whether I consider it having similar issues. I think in some ways, I think the issues are different for two reasons. One is that, firstly, is the sheer length that we see of Islamic art production in terms of how long that's been going on in comparison to a very short period for the Sikhs. So we have, Sikh art didn't have enough time to evolve and change shape over time. We also have Islamic artistic traditions that might come from the Deccan, that might be Mughal, that might be Persian, and those traditions are transferring, from Persian art into India. I imagine that many of those issues are the same across whether it's Islamic art, Hindu art, or Sikh art. We're constantly asking questions about, well, who is the patron? Where's the bias? Is there any bias here? Who's leaving me this story behind? Is the artist, is he flattering his patron who's in the image? Is he being instructed to, paint an accurate picture for us? In many cases with Sikh art, what we find is that the European patrons, in many cases, are giving us a very interesting narrative and story of what's happening. They've witnessed something. They're revealing something that isn't easily being revealed. I think also the challenge here specifically with Sikh art is that I think that it's also very much related to the fact that because of colonization, because of the fact that the Punjab is annexed to the British Empire, the ideology changes so quickly. And it's the biggest challenge I think that young Sikhs or any Sikhs have is actually reconciling and coming to terms with the fact that if you're in search of this ideal of what once was pre-annexation, but what if you went back to that place, you weren't able to recognize it? What if you went back to that place, it was nothing like what you imagined it to be? What if Guru Nanak was nothing like how you imagined him to be? What happens then? Will you be content, with them meeting these people from the past and them telling you, well, actually, our traditions are very, very different to your traditions now? And just one kind of slightly comical example of that is appreciating the 16th century or the 15th century that Guru Nanak was around in. In the 15th century that Guru Nanak was around in, he wouldn't have had tomatoes, he wouldn't have had onions, he wouldn't have had cauliflower. It meant he didn't have aloo gobi. All of these very small things. He didn't even eat the same foods that you eat now and you consider to be traditional Punjabi foods, for example. So who was that man? What was his ideology, and how does it relate to us now?
Okay, thank you. Lovely answer. I'd like to put a question to Salima now. And in fact, all three speakers have spoken about...
Sorry, Alnoor, sorry to interrupt. I might have to leave, unfortunately, but I'll be more than happy to take any questions afterwards. Good luck and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Salima, my question is in relation to what the speaker said, which is really... I think the main body of the discussions has been about art seeking to transform. And I wonder whether actually we're moving away from art for art's sake. And is that a worry?
Well, this is the eternal question, isn't it? I think that what has happened because of our political and our social realities, I think art for art's sake in many ways seems such a luxury, because it seems to detach itself from what is increasingly felt, I won't say seen, felt as the artist's role. And what Santhosh was saying earlier, that we have these moments in which these very, very definite positions come into conflict, and they're opposite sides, and they're standing very clear. And the thing is that where does the artist stand? And then when we say where did the artist stand, we are not referring to one artist. We are referring to how the artist is part of a larger sensitivity, a larger community. We also know, and he pointed out the fact that it was ironic that M.F. Hussain, was part of a certain position, and then he became a victim, or he became, part of a target by others of his position. So I think these questions are highly complicated because of our realities today. I think it is no longer a question of patronage, because the patronage has also disappeared. It's been, fragmented. You have a kind of gallery patronage, you have state patronage, you have the international patronage in these times of the biennales and the triennales and the residencies, which beckon. And the thing to notice is, what is the flavor of the moment? Because sometimes you find that they all have their compulsions and their agendas, and through that the artist kind of has to negotiate what they themselves feel is important to document at that particular moment in time with the resources that they have. So it's no longer so simple as to talk about, art for life or art for art's sake. It is far more, I don't want to use the word complex, but it's more devious than that, far more devious than that. So therefore you have to look at what is coming out, because after all, it is the outcome of what you see, what you point out, what's going on. This week there was this wonderful news of one of my students, or our students from Lahore, who's an Afghan, whose work of art is Aziz Hazara. He's moving a container full of garbage from Afghanistan, and the container has been labeled as artwork. He's taking the garbage from Bagram, which was the American base there, and shipping it across the world to the US, and wanting us to leave it there, like your litter is coming home, but he's labeled it as an artwork. So what do you call this? You call it the feelings of this young artist, very young. He came to Lahore to study. You know, he was just come out of high school, really. But over these years, there is that whole anger that this child experienced and lived through. And as he said, I only knew war. It was only when I was outside the war that I could actually theorize and think of how to respond. His response was to tell the Americans, take your litter back home, and they had left it there. So he decided to do it for them. And it's an artwork, for God's sake. It should travel from one part of the world to the other, because art does travel from one part of the world to the other. So I think that the artist gets his own back, if you like, on what is going on in the world, and how clever they are, how well they're able to do it. It varies, and I think it also is the culmination of the depth of their love and their pain, both. And that's how they become effective, and that's how they communicate. And it's also universal. So I think it is no longer, you can't couch it anymore in these easy ways. It kind of moves out of labels, it moves out of sentences, it moves out of theories.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that answer. I want to pick on a point that you made in relation to what you just said. Earlier on in your presentation, you talked about, the army exposing kind of airplanes, and you use a sentence, this is masquerading as artwork. And yet we have here the example of basically rubbish could also be masquerading. Europe, we have that where the artist says art, because I said,
well, you're breaking up, you can't hear it.
Yeah, my point was, who defines art?
Yes, that can be a question. Who defines art? Because we constantly, I just love what one of my first year students said to me, who later became a very well-known designer. It was the first time I got them to make collage and to bring, real rubbish to the classroom. And they did some very interesting work, which was responding to something that I'd set up there in the studio, but they were doing it out of waste materials. And then we had a discussion after it, and people were saying, oh, this really looks like this, and it's come out of litter or whatever. And then this young man says to me, Mrs. Hashmi, it's wonderful, but is it art? And I stopped dead in my tracks, and I said, yes. So who decides? Does my first year student decide? Does the teacher decide? Does XYZ decide? I think there are no pat answers. I think that because, if you've lived as long as I have, and I'm a very old lady, you have seen these descriptions, delights, eulogies, art which has been revered and paid for by high prices and patrons, and you turn around, 20 years later and nobody remembers them. Does it cease to be artwork? Or is it still there because it's not being no longer in the limelight? Doesn't have a right to claim what it once had a right to do. I think there are no oversimplifications that can one offer. like life, art is what you live. I mean, that is the final say in the matter. And these definitions shift, and I've seen many shift, and all of them are wanting at some stage or the other. And then another layer is added, and you live with that the way that we live with whatever life offers us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Santhosh, I hope my Wi-Fi connection is a little bit better now. I'd a question from the audience, and I'll read that almost the way it is, but I think the suggestion is, in your mind, sufficiently delineated lines that were brought about, going from colonialist era to perhaps a partition. Can you look at art and find, I guess, discrepancies as the outcome of political events?
I couldn't really fully gather the question, but will you please repeat the first part of it? Second part, I could.
Sure, yeah. To what extent do you think in South Asia we've had various political upheavals, we've had a partition and so on. To what extent is that represented through changes in art forms?
If you think in terms of a thematic representation of this division, that we have, a long history, both in literature, poetry, art to a certain extent, if you look at some of the modernist artists for that matter. But if you see the implication of it in terms of and the way in which those wounds are repeatedly kind of kept alive, then it has a much longer history than merely descriptive history. That history that we can definitely easily recognize, categorize, catalog, and produce one singular narrative. But what is more interesting would be the traveling of this, the way in which it manifests. Sometimes not manifest in terms of its actual material manifestation, but in terms of drawing some past politically, sometimes very reactionarily, sometimes very radically. So in that sense, it is very alive in multiple ways, not necessarily always in a grim sense. At the same time, those wounds are actually recalled to talk about the contemporary in a very effective manner. If you look like something like Romana Hussain, or people like people who recalled the Bengal famine, or in their work, not necessarily in terms of historical narrative, but in terms of evoking the emotional geography, history as an evocative category than merely descriptive category. So in that sense, it has multiple lives. But we generally talk only one kind of a life that have materiality, referentiality. You can certain archival quality in terms of, but that mnemonic aspect of that is hardly talked about. Only the archival of the partition is talked about. I think what is important art historically to my mind is that the embodied and the mnemonic and the kind of emotional geography that it creates, how to deal with it, what kind of discursivity one produce around it, both artistically as well as in terms of conceptually, historically. I think that would be the real challenge to my mind.
Now, to explore is the protest movements we've seen in India, that the police has come down very hard on artwork that is seen to be inimical to what the nation should be representing. We've actually seen that in Pakistan as well. Fields of and at a hall, and 2 years ago, I think. We're seeing more and more. Is this happening more and more, do you think? The nation determining what is art?
and I kind of follow what Salima Hashmi was telling a little bit before, that one can say that there are efforts from not only from a particular political party I'm talking about, or not only from the context of India. I'm not talking about there is a particular political party in power, there is a we are in danger. Definitely the degree of danger can vary from one political party to the other. But if you look at our recent history, most of the South Asian regions, actually the state is trying to all the time define or either coercively in terms of force, in terms of incarceration, in terms of filing cases against them, either by state themselves or some state players, and so on and so forth. That is a kind of constant element that sometimes we can track through certain legal debates in terms of blasphemy laws, or in terms of censorships, and so on and so forth. But that won't give you the full picture of it. There are two other aspects also has to be taken into considerations. People sometimes kind of self-censor in order to be part of the statist narrative as well as in the market narrative. That is the one dynamics that we hardly account. The second thing is that sometimes people masquerade and transgress. People kind of subverse these narratives, not necessarily like in terms of challenging it in say in the juridical discourse, but bring these debates itself, these debates or these state coercive measures itself into the domain of artistic debate in a very subversive way, and challenge them subterraneously, create other kinds of narrative, in the sense that there is a very, 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 very vibrant and dynamic way of dealing with this question. This is something that the easy example would be something like the Iranian film, that how that that's a kind of very obvious and very, very. But if you see artistic practices as well, we see this the way in which the artists kind of interrogate them, not necessarily through the discursive the kind of so-called discursive form, but in multiple other affective ways. So it's a very, very, what I'm going to say is that this is not like very, very easily discernible, and one can bracket off something as complete surrender or completely part of the state, or somebody as the avant-garde and the radical. I think it's much more layered and much more negotiated, and the kind of artistic strategy people deploy as individual or part of a collective or a collective identity is much more complex than that. The way it operates in the world is much more layered than the way in which we narrate them. So that's what I feel.
I think also, in a country like Pakistan, which has seen years and years of military dictatorship, artists invent vocabulary and they invent idioms that are very subtle, and they're not easily discernible, as you just said, Santhosh, that they talk symbolically. You have to unravel the meanings. Artists are very bloody-minded. They don't take a given situation as being insurmountable, and they will find their ways around it. And you do find that sometimes you think, okay, so this work is about that, but you spend a little bit of time with it, and you find, okay, it's speaking with forked tongues. It's pretending to be something, and it's actually saying something else. And it's very exciting when you do understand the subterfuge that an artist invents to get around censorship, to get around all kinds of taboos that are there. But also you have to survive, so you find ways of survival. And there's some places you simply cannot go. I have come across certain instances when, a young artist is faced with a choice where it may be a matter of life and death with what they're showing. And they have to be smart enough to, as they say, outlive their enemies. and therefore find ways of communication which are less apparent, but they're very, very potent. So I think like poets, like writers across the globe who have lived through difficult times, they find ways of being understood. And it never changes. I mean, if you look at Ghalib's poetry of speaking of the terrible, outcome of what happened in Delhi in 1857, but you read that poetry now and it seems that it's about today. So, it continues, the cycle continues, some phenomena keep reoccurring, and the universality of the individual's talent, their genius, is something that delights you, and you say, okay, art lives.
Thank you. Now, I want to turn to another issue, which of course has permeated art discourse for quite a while, and this is the extent of commercialization of art. Art as an investment, art as a cultural instrument, and also in a digital world where art forms immense. We've recently seen $69 billion sort of for the first 5,000 days, I think it's called, which was bought by an Indian crypto investor, in fact. And I think that opens up a new element of the exhibit art is very different from the physical world. This is. And this is answered by Salima.
The connections are intermittent, so I couldn't want to completely get the.
We got the gist of it, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, art is big time investment. We have found in the last 2 years, when we thought the market would really disappear, sitting at home and looking at what's going on, you find that suddenly the auction houses are abuzz with sales which have to do with every kind of investment in the great masters, also with people who you would think would be not a very great investment, more ephemeral work. And there's somebody like Banksy who makes great fun of the whole process. Yes, the commodification, the fact that, okay, these are material goods, but then there are innumerable artists who don't buy into that. And we come across them all the time. They are people who are far more concerned about self-reflection, about wanting to talk with people who are around them. And yes, if the work sells or if there's some means to sustain them, they're content to carry on. There is no single way of actually judging where the amount of money that goes into investment, does it actually affect art making or not? Because I find that yes, it does affect a certain number of people who make good suddenly. But in the long run, I think that it's just a kind of froth. And that's the way that a lot of young artists who are working today, who really reject this way of making themselves seen, heard, felt, understood. There are enough of them to make one not be jaded about things like the art market. I don't know. I have great faith in individual artists who are willing to pay tribute to their own talent. And if it sells, if it gets by, if it buys them petrol for their vehicle, whether it's a motorbike or whether it's a car, good enough. It is difficult in many cases for survival, but I do find that they can get by without the formulaic art market.
Thank you. Santhosh?
I think the only thing that I can talk about this relation to art and market, this is something that I don't think we can, characterize always in negative terms. I think that is also kind of a misnomer. It also comes from some kind of a very, polemical, romantic notions about art. I think in certain sense that kind of notion also can be curtailing the potential of art, in the sense that art become reduced into some kind of esoteric aesthetical practice. Art have as if that is outside of all kinds of social evil. It doesn't have any kind of a contamination and so on and so forth. I think art actually derives from interacting with the real world in its, both, goods and bads. And definitely there is no way of art not engaging with market in a capitalist economy. Definitely that is inevitable. Like any other intellectual labor, it does have to engage with the market economy. The danger would be that how an art is valued is reduced into some kind of a commodity fetish. The sense that the value of the art is equated to the money that it generates in the market. That is where the problem begins. It is not that any interaction with the commodity world or the market essentially contaminate the artwork. It is rather the way in which one value work is reduced into the quantitative aspect of its exchange value. That is where the problem begins. I personally, I don't think there is a way of some or other in the sense that there is no way one can completely isolate oneself from the real world relationships. So definitely one need to develop strategies to counter the dominance of or the kind of the way in which capital is eroding all kinds of heterogeneity of life, the way it homogenizes cultures and so on. And there are multiple ways in which either individual level or in terms of as groups, as collectives, as networks, people are trying to find ways of both interacting with them at the same time, having adequate distance to interrogate them. So I think, especially if you look at the contemporary art practices, even though we have this large scale global exhibition, curatorial phenomena, and so on and so forth, at the same time, we can see that there are people developing their own alternatives, ways of circulating, finding, inventing their own audiences, their own. It's not like we are waiting for an existing audience. We are creating newer audiences, reaching out. So there are a very active domain. So sometimes what happens, even though it comes from very good, political intent, but overemphasis on the market sometimes can be counterproductive to my mind. In the sense that it's not to say that one should not criticize, market economy and the way in which capital is inflicting or infecting the art field. But at the same time, the entire emphasis on that may not be the right way to look at the dynamics and the potential of the field. That's the way I look at it. And sometimes I feel people who are coming from the marginalized community and so on and so forth, sometimes entry into the market itself is a political act, wherein which they will be able to survive and create something meaningful, interrogate the existing structures of power and so on. Otherwise, they can simply remain in the fringes and disappear and so on. So it can produce certain visibility. It can be used in terms of highlighting actual real-time social inequalities and so on. That's the way I look at it.
Davinder, of course, has left early, so thank you to him. Thank you also to the team at the South Asia Center, Nilanjan, and all the other staff, and of course for you viewers. So we hope to see you again, and thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alnoor. Yeah. Thank you, Nilanjan.